So today we're going to talk about the latest Mal Waldron release, and that is for Craft Recordings Original Jazz Classics series, and the title is Mal 2. Before we dig into it, as usual, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and follow me on Instagram at what_can_brown. So I'll say up front, before we really get into this, I do own an original, and yet I'm not going to do sort of a formal shootout on this, both because I don't think it's really helpful in terms of talking about how the new release sounds, and I'll kind of get into why. But also, my copy is in really poor condition, and it's just not even worth doing. I've kind of had this copy for a while just to say that I have it, but never really been able to enjoy it. So I'm not going to really talk about it. So let's talk about this though. So a couple of things just kind of orient you with this recording. So it was recorded over 2 sessions in March and April of I actually think it was March and May of 1957 at Rudy Van Gelder's Hackensack studio. So the first session included Mal Waldron with, it was John Coltrane, Bill Hardman, Jackie McLean, Julian Euell, and Art Taylor. So on the second session, when they came back to the studio, little bit different lineup. You still had Julian Euell, you still had obviously Mal Waldron, and you had John Coltrane, but we had Sahib Shihab sub in for Jackie McLean. We had Idrees Sulieman sub in for Bill Hardman, and then finally we had Ed Thigpen sub in for Art Taylor. So a couple of different lineups on this record, and actually it does make a difference. If you look at the tracks across both sides, certain ones sound better. And actually, it's the later session tracks that sound just a little bit better than the earlier session. It's not just a criticism or even a a noteworthy point on this reissue. It's simply how the recording was done. It was a better recording when they came back to the studio for whatever reason. Another interesting thing is that there was a couple of tracks recorded at that second session that didn't make this album. They were cut. So they did eventually get released on a Mal Waldron album called The Dealers, which came out in 1964. Unfortunately, that album was put out on Status. So Status was Prestige's sort of budget subsidiary, often had recycled vinyl. I've never seen a copy of The Dealers that didn't have recycled vinyl, and therefore a pretty prominent hiss. And so kind of unfortunate that we don't have a clean copy of that, maybe at some point in the future. So one thing I found interesting is that right after recording the first of the 2 sessions for this album, Mal Waldron actually became the full-time accompanist for Billie Holiday. So fortunately, that didn't stop him, even though I suppose he would have been touring with her, that didn't stop him from continuing to record over those years leading up to Billie Holiday's death. In fact, Mal Waldron had, I think, something like 4 albums that he put out for New Jazz, either as a leader or as like a co-leader, that led up to him putting out the album Left Alone for Bethlehem, which I think was put out right after Billie Holiday's death. Over this period of time, though, Mal Waldron didn't just record, say, as a leader or a co-leader. He also recorded in Prestige's sort of house band. So a lot of these like jam sessions he was a part of. I think he might have even been in the Prestige All-Stars for a few of those albums that were put out. But Waldron really did play a variety of styles for a variety of musicians over this period of time for both Prestige as well as New Jazz. So one of the reasons why I'm particularly excited about Mal 2 coming out in the Original Jazz Classics series is that up until 2021, there hadn't been a single reissue of this album in the United States on vinyl, right? So the only way you would have been able to get it is to find one of these trashed out original copies like the unfortunate copy that I have. I think you could get it on a Japanese reissue label, but really there hadn't been, again, anything that was widely available in the US. It was never originally put out on Original Jazz Classics in, say, the 80s or 90s, and so this is the first time under this label. Now, I did say up until 2021. So it turns out that Electric Recording Company, which is an outfit out of the UK, decided to press this. Now they did it in very limited quantities, and I believe it costs something around the lines of like $600 or $700 at retail. Currently goes for even more than that because it's so scarce, and apparently it sounds pretty good. I don't know, I've never heard it, but I think it's very exciting that OJC put this out again under Craft Recordings, and everybody can get it for $39. That's full retail. Actually, I think as of today on Amazon you can get it for like $33. Maybe I'll throw a link in the bio in case you want to go check it out. So a few other things, as with the other Original Jazz Classics editions, this is 180 gram. It was pressed at RTI with all analog mastering by from the original master tapes by Kevin Gray, and it does indeed have a tip-on jacket. Also has this obi. So, you know, tangibly what this tip-on jacket gets you is this nicer construction. Typically, you can kind of see the frame outline underneath the backing sheet. Very sturdy, really just kind of nice, high-quality thing. One of the things that people are talking about quite a bit lately is how covers compare. Right, so coloring on covers and whether images are as sharp as they should be, as well as generally the placement, because sometimes labels are zooming in or zooming out. So on this, I actually think that they did a pretty stellar job duplicating it. Now this one's going to look a little bit browner, which could have something to do with either dirt or certainly tobacco smoke. I'm not exactly sure because I don't have a very clean cover, but what I can say about the reissue is that the clarity of Mal Waldron is pretty much identical. There might just be a little bit darker, just a tiniest little bit. It's not even significant, a little bit darker on the reissue, but otherwise, you know, looks great. Obviously, what Kraft does with almost all the releases, to my knowledge, is they replace the original catalog number with their catalog number. I know that not everybody likes that, but it doesn't really bother me that much. The basic look of the label is the same, even though Kraft doesn't try to replicate, say, Bergenfield addresses. They don't replicate the New York City addresses. They just kind of have a Kraft Recordings thing up there. But otherwise, it's the Fireworks label, and it looks great. All right, so I don't want to confuse people as I go through a couple of these tracks and provide my comments. And so what I need to mention is that the track listing on the back is wrong, okay? Now, that's not a problem with just this reissue. It's also a problem with the original. It's they did a good job of replicating exactly what was on the back for each of these, but they got the track listing wrong originally, and that was replicated here. So the track listing is actually correct on the label of the record. Okay, so that's what I'm going by. I'm not going by the sort of erroneous listing here. I'm going by the order of the tracks that's on the label, which is also the same as what the music is. So yeah, just kind of keep that in mind. All right, so I want to talk to you a little bit generally about the music to kind of orient you and set the tone for what you might expect, I suppose, from this release. And then I'm going to talk about just a couple of tracks, give you my sort of closing thoughts. So firstly, from a quality perspective, there's no noise floor on this, so it's great. Obviously, my original has, a ton of noise floor. Most of that's through the nature of scratches and imperfections that actually create that noise floor. But this is a very quiet recording. I think, though, that as much as some of these things that are consistent across jazz albums, like no noise floor and tap your foot to the music and that kind of thing, almost kind of orient people around what they can expect, I think that people are going to be a little bit taken aback by this music. Mal Waldron was a little bit known for it, not at this phase necessarily incorporating a lot of atonality or free jazz elements, but he was very adventurous from a compositional structure standpoint, and even like melodies. And so it's gonna sound strange, I think, to some people who are used to buying titles in the series, say by Miles Davis or even Thelonious Monk. I mean, let's be real, Thelonious Monk was doing very adventurous things. Mal Waldron does very adventurous things here as well, but kind of in a different way. What I would say about that in more detail is that there's less focus on the blues. There's less predictability in terms of the compositional structure. The tracks don't really have the vibe, at least an overwhelming vibe of like repeating 8 bars or repeating 16 bars. And what I mean by that is being able to follow a chord progression that repeats every 8 bars. Things like that, tactics like that in compositions help orient the listener to help them know what to expect. So if you're listening to a tune, you kind of know when the bridge is going to happen, or about when the soloists are going to start because you have some of these cues. And some of those cues are absent from some of these pieces because, again, they're a little bit more adventurous. So I think that the overall tone of a number of these tracks is a little bit less on, say, finger-snapping blues or toe-tapping blues, if you will. And they have a little bit more of a vibe of a soundtrack or even like a movie score. And so it feels, the tone of some of these feels like they're telling a little bit of a story rather than being a repetitive tune. And so if I'm thinking about other artists who would sound like that, I think Charles Mingus is one who has a more cinematic view with how he constructs his music. There's also a lot going on in a lot of Charles Mingus's tunes in terms of different layerings of instruments you aren't used to hearing, and instruments almost interrupting each other or going on top of each other in interesting ways, having melodies and harmonies that are layered in different ways that you don't necessarily expect. And I think that some of that is present here in Mal too. So I think that the result of some of that is it gives this music, it's certainly overall slower, it builds slower, and so you kind of have to be a little bit patient with it. There's even a sense, sort of a sense of melancholy, I think, that kind of pervades these tracks. And so rather than relying on, I'll say, like virtuosic soloists, which, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of that because of these horns that we have here. There's lots of solos and they are exciting. I still think that one of the things that really characterizes this album is the slow and kind of plodding way of building intensity and creating, I don't know, just how Mal Waldron creates some of his compositions. All right, so the first track I want to cover is called From This Moment On. And I want to say just a couple of things about that, I suppose. One is that I think it's one of the more energetic tracks on the album, so it's probably a good opener. Kind of brings you in a little bit slowly to some of the compositional structure that gets a little bit more challenging. Coltrane sounds absolutely phenomenal on this track, and he does take the opening solo. And he just sounds really, really dynamic. And in fact, I think that the music beforehand is a little bit thinner. It's not as detailed. It just doesn't sound as robust. Like the tones of the layered instruments sound a little thin. And when I first put this on, I was a little bit worried. I did end up checking with the original, and that's exactly how the original sounds as well. So it's not a problem with this particular release. But what gave me a lot more confidence is that as soon as Coltrane enters and he takes the first solo, he just sounds phenomenal. I do think that if this album overall was better recorded originally, there'd be a little bit more of a in-your-face kind of sound with Coltrane, almost like, you know, a little bit more air around his horn that feels like it might, I don't know, provide a little bit more energy in the recording. And so it's not a criticism because it's the same thing that I heard in the original, but just kind of know that it still does sound maybe just slightly dated, doesn't sound as clean, I would say, as some of Rudy Van Gelder's later recordings, but certainly relatively speaking, Coltrane sounds phenomenal on the opening track and when he solos. So one kind of fun thing is when Coltrane hands off the solo to Sahib Shihab, because he does it just not effortlessly, but you barely perceive that he hands off the solo. You kind of have to pay attention and realize, oh wait, that's not Coltrane's tenor. All of a sudden you're hearing Sahib Shihab, but because they're playing it like the same, you know, almost the same note or the same like general spot, it's almost imperceptible when he hands off the solo. And I think that that's really cool because it shows a heavy amount of collaboration and that they're very much in tune with each other, that Coltrane wouldn't need to, say, resolve his solo in any obvious way before handing it off to Shihab. And so I think that that's a really fun thing to hear. When Idrees Sulieman comes in for his solo on trumpet, what I will say actually with this recording, and because of how clean it is with the OJC, is that there's a lot more detail around Sulieman's horn. And I would say, unfortunately, what that does here is it highlights some of the sloppiness of his playing. And I'll say sloppy. Everybody had different style. And it just so happened that Sulieman incorporated a lot more air. He also used a lot of like half valve. So where you're not like pressing the trumpet valve all the way down to get some, I don't know, sometimes it sounds like a flub note, but I think he's intentionally incorporating some of these techniques because that's just simply a part of his style. And so because you get to hear more of that, certainly in this modern pressing than I heard on the original, I think it's kind of fun that, yes, there is a little bit more detail, but in some ways you end up hearing a little bit of the imperfections, which I think is just hey, it's part of the performance, it's part of the recording. All right, so I want to talk to you now about two of the more, I would say, challenging tracks, and that might also be not just challenging as a listener, but possibly also challenging to play. I'm not sure, but I want to talk to you about track 2, which is it's incorrect on the back. It says it's Don't Explain, but it's not Don't Explain. It is it's JM's Dream Doll, which I believe is Jackie McLean's JM's Dream Doll. So this track is taken in 3. So 3 beats per measure, but it is not a waltz. It's kind of like a walking 3 or like a plodding 3. It's just boom, 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 right? Jackie McLean here does have, I don't know, he has a thin tone, certainly relative to John Coltrane, and I don't know if that's simply because of how he felt that particular day, or maybe it's showing a little bit of his youth, right? In 1957, I don't think Jackie McLean had done had progressed as much as a musician as he would even just in, say, the next year or two. But it could just be this particular recording on this particular day. But his tone sounds a little thin. I will say that the piano and the bass sound excellent here backing him. And it actually showcases why I said up front that one of the sessions sounded better than the other session. I think this session that produced this track does sound a little bit better than the session that produced that first track, and specifically relevant in the piano and bass. I think that the bass sounds actually more natural too in track 2 versus how it sounds in track 1. By comparison with Jackie McLean, Coltrane plays here as well. It has a very full tone, sounds excellent as only he could. It's hard to find examples when Coltrane didn't. Let's see. Bill Hardman follows. Trumpet player Bill Hardman, and he has quite a clean tone as well, especially in comparison with Idrees Sulieman. And so I think it's really interesting to hear these 2 tracks back to back and hearing some of the just some of the differences between how the musicians played, but also perhaps how the recordings were done. Because, like I said, I was able to kind of pick out a little bit more, sort of detail and interest, I suppose, in the cleaner recorded track. What I will say about this particular one, JM's Dream Doll, is it is a very stark track. You definitely have to be patient with it because the structure of the composition doesn't really help you understand where you are in the piece. And the result of that is that it makes it seem like the track is longer than it is. Right? It's kind of like the idea that if you're driving to a place for the first time, it seems like it takes longer. Whereas once you know the directions, then you kind of know what to expect and you know where you're headed, and it just doesn't seem like it does. I think that's the case here. If there are groupings of bars in this piece that repeat in terms of chord progression, it isn't as apparent as you might find in say something that's a little bit more traditional, like an 8 or a 16 bar type of structure. All right, the last track that I wanted to talk about kind of on its own, at least before I give you my final thoughts, is track 4, and it's called One by One. So I think that this is going to be one of the more challenging ones, perhaps, for folks who are not used to Mal Waldron's music. Again, this is by far not the most adventurous that he got with his music, but I think it's relatively adventurous considering the time period that we're talking about. So One by One has very much a metronome kind of feel to it. It is far from a catchy melody, almost sounds like a clock ticking. I will say, though, that it's probably also the most overtly blues track on the record. So those 2 statements are a little bit, like asynchronous, right? Where like one, it's like metronome type of feel, it's almost robotic, but then it also has this blues kind of elements. Once you finally get past the melody, which again is not a catchy melody. Once you get past the melody and it opens up for solos, that's when I think the musicians sound perhaps some of the most relaxed that they do on this entire album. And there's more of a sort of traditional sound in terms of trading of solos. But I think if folks are wanting to walk away from this album and have melodies in their head that they are going to be whistling, I just don't think you're going to have as much of that. I think this is more of the type of album that's a little bit more of a focused listening thing. Obviously, I'm not going to tell you how to listen to music, but that's, I don't know, something that's characteristic, I think, about Mal Waldron's music versus, say, a lot of the other types of jazz music that was being put out at this time. So in kind of summary, in terms of my thoughts, what I will say is even just comparing, say, just this pressing, and I say comparing because you have these different sessions and you have these different musicians involved, right? I think that Coltrane sounds great just throughout. If you're a Coltrane fan, you're going to find a lot to love on this album. He sounds just really good. Generally speaking, Jackie McLean here has a much thinner tone than Sahib Shihab, and so I think Sahib stands out a little bit more. Julian Euell's bass sounds better on the later recorded date. I'm sure simply because it was a better recorded session, whereas you don't really hear the attacks as much. It's a little bit boomier on the earlier recorded date. I said it before, Hardman has a better tone than Sulieman, I think, throughout. And I would say that Waldron also, his piano sounds like it was better recorded on the later date. Now, I'm splitting hairs. I don't think if I played these tracks out of order and like didn't know exactly what session was what, that I would necessarily pick it out. But again, I was trying to listen for differences, figure out if there was something to hear between the two sessions that made up this recording. And I did hear some minor things, but I don't think, I don't want to say most people aren't going to acknowledge it, but if you weren't aware that there were multiple sessions, you wouldn't necessarily think about it. Put it that way. All right, so final thoughts on this release. I think it's fantastic. It sounds really good. It is not, I've said it before in these OJC series, I think, and some other reissues. It's not a tone poet. You're not going to be overwhelmed with, sort of the, splashy cymbals and things like that. I think it's a very natural sounding recording. I think it does a really good job of representing everything that is on the original pressing as well. I didn't encounter any errors, drop out, anything like that on my particular pressing. But I'd be curious if anybody else had heard anything that perhaps I didn't. But really, and I said this up front, there's just almost no way to hear this album in a affordable manner, right? Because what are you going to do? You're going to track down an original in great shape and spend thousands of dollars, or you're going to get an ERC edition and pay $700. So I personally think that this is a great way to hear the album, and it's a recommendation for me for anyone who is interested in more about more of Mal Waldron's work. So. That's it for now. Thanks very much. I'll see you next time.